Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversation of Power. In another episode, we have come together again. And in this episode, we are going to talk about Iran with my guest. I will ask questions and we will try to understand what is going on in Iran. As we know, there is a war ongoing, unfortunately. That is the life of civilian is matter. We have to think about them. And I hope deeply the Iranian people will reach to the bright future soon with their family, with their kids, their daughters. But we have to understand the situation in our part from the perspective of the geopolitics of international affairs, how these regional affairs are working, where we come to this point, why these countries firing missiles each other, and especially since last yesterday or last 2 days, the things are changing at the pace of the hypersonic missiles. When one missile is firing from the Gulf or from an aircraft carrier, the things are changing. Another news come to on social media. This is really a difficult time, hard time for Iranian people. I deeply share their concern. And today we will try to understand from the historical background, the geopolitical context. I have a valuable guest, Dr. Maral, will joining me today. She's an expert on the Iran's social movements and Iranian studies. Dr. Maral, thank you very much for joining me, joining my show, and spare your time.
Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Maral, just as I mentioned, this a historical context. The things not just come to emerge it over the night or over the day. Can you little bit please provide an overview of the historical events? What kind of the events or the things leading to the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran in 1979, and the role of Ayatollah Khamenei is important, I think, in shaping the foundational principles. Tell us, please.
Sure. In order to explain the 79 revolution, I would uh, perhaps take your audience to on a little trip in history and move the pole actually past to early 1900s, so early 20th century, when in Iran there was a constitutional revolution, which was a revolution much like the constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire. Up to that point in Iran, the Shah or the king had absolute and arbitrary powers, and he would exercise them. And at some point in the late 1800s, after two large concessions, big concessions in wars with Russia, large parts of Iran were annexed. All the newly the southern neighbors of Russia, the former members of USSR, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and all those areas and more, Turkmenistan, were all parts of the Iranian Empire. And through Russian aggression, large parts of Iran were annexed. And at that point, Iranian elite and intellectuals started thinking of what is actually going on, and they became more informed and they in contact with the Europeans, the advancements that they had made, and so that annexation triggered a series of reforms that ended in the constitutional revolution. The first constitution of the country was drafted, and certain changes were made. The What I would argue that the first the footprint of the clerical rule was actually set in stone in during that constitutional revolution, which essentially it meant to transform Iranian citizens, Iranian individuals, from the subject of the king into citizens with rights and responsibilities. But there were different secular groups that were participating, and there were also many clergy that a very prominent clergy that were supportive of that, and also there were others that were against it, including some clergy. But in in that negotiation of powers and how to write the constitution, there were certain large concessions given to the clergy, including having clerical oversight over some resources, but at the same time, for example, public education came to effect, and the education that was formerly in many of the countries in the world were the purview of the clerical establishment, whether it's a Catholic church or Islamic clergies, were kind of secularized. And so that was, however, the constitutional revolution didn't achieve all that it wanted. And the next major movement I would go and set up and talk about the oil nationalization movement that happens post in 1953, and the coup by the CIA. So the then Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, Dr. Mossadegh, actually, um, he realized at that point, and his supporters in the National Front realized, for Iran to actually achieve those goals set in the constitutional revolution, to have a public education system, to have a public health system, to set up and build the infrastructure of the country, they needed obviously resources, they needed funds. And where would they find those funds? In the natural resources of the country, namely oil at the time, which was under was run by the British, and majority and Iranians themselves, even though they're sitting on this massive wealth, had very little, would benefit from it very little. So there was a movement. Dr. Mossadegh spearheaded internationally for Iranian oil to become nationalized, and for a while things were going well. And then the United States and UK staged a coup to remove Mossadegh and to kind of consolidate the king's power. Mohammad Reza Shah, the current crown prince's father, they brought him back to power. He had fled the country at that point, and then at that point there was a for a period of over 25 years, there was a period of severe political repression, and many groups, many opposition groups realized, okay, so this government, this structure cannot be reformed, it cannot be changed from within. And so they took up, many of them took up armed struggles, many of them took up to replace and stage a revolution. And remember, the 50s, 60s, and 70s were the times of revolutions in the world, the Cuban, the Russian, the Chinese revolutions, etc. So it was the geopolitics were different, and armed struggles and revolutions were the way to change um, states. And there were multiple ideological groups participating in that revolution, just like any other revolution in the world. There were the nationalists, such as the remnants of the National Front of Dr. Mossadegh, and the leftist groups, many of whom were participating in armed struggles, and some of them were not. And of course, there were the Islamists. One of the after effects of the coup in 1953, and the establishment of an American kind of way of government, an American a king that would um, essentially uh, be a pawn of the United States was to establish an internal opposition, an internal um, um, curb, if you will, to stop USSR's communist aggressions against Iran. And for that, they decided the best way to do that was religion and the clerical establishment. Mohammad Reza Shah's father, Reza Shah, had curbed many of the clerical establishment's powers, and Mohammad Reza Shah returned those to him, and so they managed to establish right under his nose, the clerical establishment managed to establish this large network of opposition against the group. So around the 79 revolution, when Khomeini arises, um, and I'm simplifying about 100 years of history, and collapsing it into a few minutes. So a lot of details, please understand, that are not being discussed here. So once the revolution happens, there are so many other groups participating: the left, the centrists, the MEK, the nationalists, etc., etc., and the Islamists, of course. The rhetoric of Ayatollah Khomeini was that we're going to have an Islamic Republic, there's going to be a democracy, and that the clergy are not going to rule. However, once the transitional government was formed, all of that went out the door. And as we know, the Islamists managed to consolidate power and physically eliminate many of their um, opponents. There was significant resistance within Iran, particularly from the left, the minoritized ethnics in Kurdistan, in Turkmenistan, and in other parts of the country. And it would be interesting for your audience perhaps to know that one of the largest massacres that Khomeini and his regime um, staged in Iran was in Kurdistan in just a few months after the 79 revolution, just because that region in Iran is probably one of the most, if not the most, politically mature and organized, politically organized region of Iran, and at the same time, one of the most marginalized. So, having said all of that, the Islamists take over. They establish their version of the Islamic government, and you know, here we are today at 79.
And it's very interesting, Dr. Maral. You just paint a broad and really in-depth map of this history, and even many historians, as you mentioned, that after the relations take place, Khomeini disqualified many of the participants of the revolutions. I
Yes.
think the one of them is, as you mentioned, to the Kurdistan was I think Ahmed Muftizadeh. He's one of the supporter of friend, like the friend of the Khomeini. But after the revolution take place, he was disqualified, and many other maybe from the Tudeh party.
Yeah.
And after I think the Khomeini and his friends consolidate their power, they look at to the outside of the border, or there is another dynamics. Please explain to us. I'm going to ask about the Iran and Iraqi war. Just 1 year later, after the 1979, it took place in 1980, and it continued over the spread to over the 8 year. One of the, I think, terrible war between two countries within the Islamic regime, and its impact of the Iranian society. What will be your take on this historical matter? Just there is a war, and 1 year after the revolution.
So Saddam Hussein at the time figured, well, Iran is weak. They've just established a new government. They're going through their domestic struggles, and the power is not consolidated. And as you mentioned, Khomeini has had so many of his former of the people that had helped him get to power, the Qutbzadeh, the people of the transitional government, the Bazargans, and the Ibrahim Yazdis of the world. He essentially eliminated most of them, either removed them from power or imprisoned them, or in case of Qutbzadeh, he executed him. And so many, and he outlawed the leftists, and especially armed struggle, and MEK, and so many were increasingly being eliminated from the sphere of power, and he was consolidating power within the hands of a few clerics, and with a specific ideology. And so, having seen that struggle, and at the same time, the Artesh, or the Iranian military at the point, remember, there was no IRGC at
at the
that
time.
time. It was, yeah, it was just the Artesh, or the Iranian military, that was developed by the former Shah, and supposedly they were, many of them were supposed to be very loyal to him, which happened to not be the case, because I always mention this. Khomeini arrives, I can't remember specifically in English what date it is, in February of 1979. It's 12th of the month of Bahman in the Persian calendar. And it's only 10 days later. It's not on that day that uh, that the revolution is declared victorious. It's 10 days later that declaration is made. And I always ask people, why do you think that was? Why do you think it took 10 days? Because it took 10 days for the military to actually sign a declaration, um, declaring neutrality, and that they are not going to take up an armed struggle, or a coup against the new regime. So essentially, the pride and joy of Reza Shah Pahlavi, who had spent so many resources, so much time and effort developing that, it had capitulated to the revolutionaries. And so, but at the same time, Saddam figures, I mean, there's still this Artesh is not in a position to defend the country. Iran is oil rich. We've had certain disagreements in the past. So same thing that he tried to do in Kuwait. Why don't I attack Iran and take over? And it at the same time, it wasn't helping that Ayatollah Khomeini's rhetoric was so fiery, and talking about all the Muslim people of the region to rise up against their governments, and engage in a revolution, and talking about exporting the revolution to all these other countries. And so, and Iraq, as you know, is majority Shiite. So, and Iranians have, including Ayatollah Khomeini himself, they had many Iranian clerics have lived in Najaf and Karbala for a long time. Those are holy Shiite sites, and so it's very significant. So Saddam attacked Iran in, I believe it was August of 81, about just over a year after the revolution, and occupied some border cities, including Khorramshahr and Abadan. And so many Iranians were killed. There was an official declaration of war between the two nations. However, about a year and a half later, the Iranians troops had managed to push Iraqis back to the um,
Border.
original borders beyond Arvand Road, or Shatt al Arab, depending on which part of it. And so so there was a UN resolution offered for peace and for Iraq to pay Iran retribution. However, the Islamic regime decided not to accept that, and there were several reasons. And as Khomeini has, and other high-ranking Iranian officials have always said, that war was a blessing for them, because under the guise of war, they managed to eliminate a majority of the opposition within the country, and repress people under the guise of war, and that were defending our country, and anything and everything that is not aligned with the ideology and the rhetoric of the regime would be considered a security breach and treason. And so opposition to this newly formed regime and its oppressive ways was swiftly eliminated. So the country was embroiled in 8 long years of war. So many, about 1 million people on both sides lost their lives. And at the same time, it is around that time that the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, was developed by a decree from Ayatollah Khomeini. It was highly ideological, whereas at the time, Artish, because of its historical roots, was somewhat more secular, and this was under the direct supervision of Ayatollah Khomeini. And the goal was, I mean, the promise was that they would dissolve once the war was over. But over the decades, IRGC has taken so many different formats. And once the war was over in '88, what the Islamic Republic did, and again, under Khomeini's direct um, decree and order, was killed thousands of political prisoners, many of whom had served their sentences and they were still being held. And so the numbers vary from 5 to 15,000, and we to this date we still don't know how many thousands of people were killed, they were killed quietly and in a matter of a couple of months. Um, and so it took, while some insiders, some political activists and families of dissidents knew about this, it was highly it was kept quiet, mostly from most of the world, from most of the Iranians, and it took uh, about a generation for people to, first of all, find out about it, and then so many wouldn't even believe that the regime would engage in such brutality, especially because the regime had always branded anyone in opposition. They still do to this point as traitors, as anti-revolutionaries, as those who are American stooges or want to kind of are co-opted by Saddam, and essentially dehumanizing these people and justifying their physical elimination. And at the same time, the Islamic Republic, since day one, it's it's not just the domestic repression and elimination, physical elimination of dissidents. They have done this extraterritorially, several assassinations, um, an assassination attempt across Europe, and North America and other parts of the world, including many Kurdish um, uh, leaders. And you will see in our discussion, you will see this trend of animosity and repression of the Kurdish groups and politicians to this day. And we will. I hope that we can talk about why that is, and it's partly, like I mentioned, because those areas are so politically mature and organized and armed.
And Khomeini succeeded to establish its regime in 1971, then go to the war with Iran and exit with war after the 8 years. And now it must have some good foundation and good ground to dealing with its oppositions, and as you say, to dealing with them even outside of the border. And now, what are just I want to come to an important reformist area during the Khatami. What are the key internal challenges faced by the regime during the reformist area under the Khatami, especially from 1997 to 2005, and how did they affect political discourse in Iran?
So once the war is over, it's a devastated country that needs to be built up. And so there are 8 years of Rafsanjani, the former, the late President Rafsanjani, um, and over those 8 years and post-war, the country has a few years of the time to breathe and to try to reestablish itself and build itself up. And slowly the cracks and the gaps in the cracks in the ideology of the regime are becoming more and more apparent, and there is a new faction within the elite of the Islamic Republic, including Khatami, including um, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who your audiences might know. He was the leader, one of the leaders of the 2009 movement, and he was the former prime minister whose role was eliminated after the war with Iraq um, because of some changes to the constitution and also his internal disagreements with the now late Ayatollah Khomeini. So there are cracks, and the reformists form around this idea. They understand that this regime is not going to last without some serious reforms, because there is widespread dissent in the country. And I mean, the Islamic Republic is known as the unfinished state or the unfinished revolution, because there are so many that are still in dissenting. There are so many that are dissatisfied, and their grievances have not been met since the 79 revolution. And though they might not have been as a large of a group at the beginning, but over the years and after every presidential election after presidential election, social movement after social movement, that base of support of the Islamic Republic has shrunk. So the Khatamis of the world and the reformists in general had this idea that this regime that the state needs some domestic reforms in how it is run if it's going to continue and survive. Otherwise, it would collapse. And some of these reforms are like trickle down economics, having a bit more um, socioeconomic justice, some social freedoms, and some more powers given to to lean into the republican aspect of the Islamic Republic, not so much to the clerical powers having, because the office of the president in Iran essentially at times has very little power. The constitution is devised in a way that the power is concentrated in the hands of the supreme leader, and so they wanted more powers and more say to be given to the parliament, to the other two to the other two essentially branches of the government, the to have a more independent judiciary. But I mean, all of those are well and good, but you have to understand the such reforms, while they were welcome, but by some in the middle class white segments of the urban Persian middle class, they were still not addressing the deep-rooted issues in the Islamic Republic. They wouldn't entirely address the issue of economic and class disparity, the issue of that essentially the Islamic Republic is essentially a gender apartheid regime, and that women are second class citizens, and the problems that minoritized ethnics in Iran, the Azerbaijanis, the Arabs, the Kurds, Turkmens, etc., the Baluch have. Iran is 49% non-Persian. So in terms of numbers, we can't really call them ethnic minorities. Um, I would rather use the term minoritized ethnics because it points to the fact that they were systematically and historically marginalized, and pushed to the margins. And so the reformists were still far more appealing to the urban middle class Persian speaking or the assimilated Iranian. But so many were still not content with that. And it all came to heat, in my opinion, in 2009 Green Movement. In 2009 Green Movement, Mir Hossein Mousavi that I just talked about, the former member of the former premier during the war, he is known as the premier of the war, wartime premier, and he was very close to Ayatollah Khomeini. So he became the candidate, him along with Mehdi Karoubi, another cleric. Um, Mousavi is not a cleric, he's a technocrat. Karoubi is a cleric. He was the former Speaker of the House. He was also another regime insider. So they run for presidency independently, of course, but their rhetoric and they fall within the reformist discourse.
Dr.
Along,
Maral, just
yes,
before you go to the detail, you wrote these books about the Green Movement, Iranian Green Movement, and
yes,
it's very interesting. It started before even the Arab Revolution, Arab Spring taking place in the Arabian Peninsula or Arab countries. This is very interesting, and it has, I think, the links as you mentioned in your books. There is the links with the social media. This is very interesting. I just let me ask my next questions and go to the
sure,
detail, please. And
sure.
you can also please tell us a little bit more about your books. What you tell the audiences and the people who don't have knowledge about Iran. What does the movement exactly is, and why did the 2009 Green Movement protests expose fractures within the regime structure? And what lessons did the leadership learn from suppressing this Green Movement?
Sure, and it actually nicely ties to what I was going to talk about. So I started gathering my data and collecting everything in 2009 while the movement was happening. Um, um, I noticed that, I mean, the media, the Western media was largely dubbing the Green Movement as, first of all, they named it the Green Movement, um, and they were dubbing it a Twitter revolution. And that kind of didn't sit well with me. And I was starting my graduate studies, my master's. So I decided to do my thesis, my master's thesis on the Green Movement. And I looked at the rhetoric as the promises and the discussions of the three main leaders of the Green Movement, Mir Hossein Mousavi, Mehdi Karoubi, and interestingly, for the first time, Mir Hossein Mousavi's wife, Zahra Rahnavard, who for the first time came out and accompanied her husband on the campaign trail. Before that, that was a no-no in Iranian politics. That was not something that politicians did, and she did that. And keep in mind, all of them, including Rahnavard, are um, regime elite that are having some internal arguments. So I looked at their discourse and the promises that they had made in terms of their economic prosperity and the rights of women and such things. All three of them, to see what they were promising. How are those promises actually achievable, and um, how did they impact the uprising that came after? And I looked at YouTube videos for a variety of reasons. And at the same time, social media research was very novel. Again, it was back in 2009, 2010 that I was doing this. And Twitter was a new thing. And I did it on YouTube for a variety of reasons. One, because I'm an exile, I don't have access to data on the ground. And I wanted to understand the role of this new technology that on social movements, and role of this new media, how this is going to impact it. And at the same time, in states like Iran, where uh, the media, the state media, the traditional formats of like TV and radio and publications are are serving the interests of the elite and are controlled by the political establishment. For example, the Islamic Republic Broadcasting (IRIB), um, uh, which its building was bombed in the war like a couple of hours ago, it is under the direct supervision of the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and prior to him, Ayatollah Khamenei picked the head of the IRIB, and so getting data from those sources is not quite um, reliable. And in those cases, social media such as YouTube, they were revolutionizing, democratizing um, access to media. And so I selected those videos and conducted my research on them. And what we will see, what I noticed is, despite the rosy picture that the rhetoric of Musavi uh, and the rest of them were painting, all the promises that they were making. First of all, some of them were still inadequate. They weren't still along the lines of the reformist rhetoric. They weren't addressing the grievances of so many segments of the population, as I mentioned before. And at the same time, so many of the promises they were making were not achievable because as I mentioned, the institution of presidency in Iran doesn't have those powers. Power is concentrated in the hands of the supreme leadership, and um, the leadership, the debate, as they call it, and or was, I should say, because this is such a peculiar time we're talking about. Um, and so what and I suggested that the social actors, the people on the streets with agency, they understand what they're doing, and once they take to the street for a cause, at some point, a focal point of the um, movement, they understand, they decide whether or not they're going to continue. And that focal point is because one of the arguments, again, put out by the elite, the scholars and journalists, was that the violence, the state was too violent, and that caused the demobilization of the protest. Give me just 1 second. I'm hearing some feedback. I'm hoping that would fix it. And so I wanted to see if that was true and if there was actually enough, if repression had something to do with it. So what we see is at the focal point of the movement, which is the day Nida Agha Sultan, a young woman that got shot dead, and I mean her picture went viral throughout the world. Um, the people on the street, the social actor understands at that point that, okay, so this is no longer a peaceful protest, and the the price is high. There's a very high price to be paid. Do I want to continue? Is it worth it for me to continue on the street and protest because I believe in what I'm being promised by these people or not? And as we can see, people demobilized. Um, so I argue that one of the reasons that they demobilized was because they didn't fully believe the promises that was being made to them, and they could understand that this rhetoric can only take me so far, but not as far as I want to go. Um, and um, and I also argue that um, state repression cannot be, I mean, it's not without impact, obviously, but it can't be the only reason that people dispersed and demobilized and left the streets. Because in 79, for example, the state repression and violence was far more. And in Arab Spring, about a year and a half, a year and a half later, on Tahrir Square in Egypt and other places, repression was far more, and still people didn't demobilize. So what's going on? There has to be other reasons, and I argue that one of the main reasons was the reformist rhetoric, and from there, what I concluded was that the reformist rhetoric kind of failed in 2009 movement, and this is not an alternative, a democratic alternative, and people implicitly or explicitly understand this, that this is not going to deliver what they're asking for, and more structural um, changes need to be made. And um, just serendipitously, when I was about to publish this as a book, about a couple of weeks, about actually a day before the book was going to be published, it was in actually early 2018. So this is a long time I've been working on that book. Early 2018, another set of protests break down in Iran, and what we hear them say is one of the main chants, reformists um, and fundamentalist game is over. And they basically pointed out what I had predicted years earlier, that the reformist movement, I mean, the manifestation of that movement ending on the street was shouted out by the people, that this movement is done, and it cannot function, and it cannot be considered a democratic alternative.
And I think it is one of the foundational book. I will drop the link. My audiences, they can order through the Amazon or in Kindle later. This is very amazing. In early dates, even as we said before Arab Spring started, this is very early, and just the X platform, just the people meet with the not X, the time that was name is the Twitter. The people newly meeting with the Twitter, and it's interesting, to mobilize through this micro social media. It's very interesting. And Dr. Meral, just before going to the another important topic, I really wonder what happened to the Mir Hussein Musawi. Since then, at least me, I haven't heard his name in the Iranian politics. I think that time I heard he was under the house arrest. And what happened to them?
He's been under his wife, and also Karubi have been under house arrest since about 2010.
Since until today.
Yes.
Very interesting. And there is another important topic I just would like to ask. Considering the economic policies over the past decade, so how sanctions and mismanagement contributed to the current crisis with inflation exceeding the 7%, maybe above, sever the currency devaluation of Iran. Sometimes in terms of human rights, really the regime doesn't have a good record in terms of the woman, ethnic minority. But in order to be objective as a moderator, I would like to ask, sometimes there is external sanctions. They put the pressure sanctions on a country, they cut it all, your access through the world, doesn't allow you sell your oil, and many other things, and it lead the people to go to the streets. How we can answer this complex together? In one hand, there is really, we can clearly see that there is the effect of the external pressure through the sanctions, and they make it the situation. of the currency of the country, or it has access to the world market. They make it terrible and lead the people to lead the street. And on the other hand, there is really, we are talking about a governance format. They don't trade their citizenship very well. How do you see these two dilemma?
Well, we have to ask why the sanctions were imposed on Iran. Largely, the sanctions are placed on Iran by the United States and allies, not because Iran doesn't have a good human rights track record, which it doesn't, but because Iran refuses to play ball and capitulate to American hegemony. It doesn't, that doesn't indicate that Iran is in the right or in the wrong. It's just that the United States is the grand hegemon in the region, and Iran doesn't feel like it wants to play ball for a variety of reasons. It doesn't adhere to that hegemony. So and also to survive, they continue to feed the proxies and establish them. And all of those changes, by the way, came after the 2009 and in the aftermath of the 2009 Green Movement. So many different fundamental changes were made in the structure of Iranian politics um, uh, because the IRGC and the regime learned a lot from that movement. For example, the IRGC seeing and understanding the scale of the dissent in Iran, because it was the IRGC that repressed that movement. They decided to take more control of the Iranian economy. So they enmeshed themselves into control of many of the main structures, the oil, telecommunications, you name it. It is, they're either um, owners of it or they have um, controlling share in it. Um, and so um, and so they kind of they control the economy, and at the same time they started investing in cultural productions and films, concerts, this that, to elevate the nationalist centralist um, ideology of the regime without the previous hardcore Islamist veneer, whereas the IRGC would, participate, or they would have favored a more hardcore Islamist and fundamentalist view of Iran. Now they would produce certain um, images, movies, concerts, etc., music. They would fund that um, to that didn't necessarily look the part of the archetype woman or man in the Islamic Republic. They look quite westernized, but at the same time uh, they would perpetuate that nationalist and kind of centrist uh, view of Iran and ideology of the regime that at the end would not really have criticized the uh, supreme leadership or the main structures of the regime. And that rhetoric of a few bad apples are doing bad things in the country, but the regime is good. So they would perpetuate that. And as for the proxies, they began kind of elevating these proxies and investing in them in the region, and that aggravated the United States more and placed more sanctions on them. And with Donald Trump kind of declaring ending the JCPOA agreement, nuclear agreement with Iran, there were the economic pressures were quite severe on people. And add to that the absolute mismanagement, the lack of political will, and at the same time resources available to run the country. And so it pushed so many average citizens of Iran to poverty. The middle class is increasingly being thinned out. But here's the problem. Um, these members of the middle class that are now part of the lower classes, their class consciousness or their understanding of themselves and their positionality is still middle class. And so they would join forces with many of the traditional members of the lower classes and take to the streets and demand to be for the basic necessities of life, because as you know, it is very difficult in many parts of the country to even keep your children fed. Gas prices are skyrocketing. Resources that were previously available and to people for free, for example, some hospitals and education, public education, and all those were subsidized, and many cases, especially in the first 20 years of the regime, were free, are now extremely expensive, and so many people can't afford that. So naturally, there's going to be an explosion.
So, Dr. Maral, how this just fast forward in December 2025, first the people took place with the you know just initially spiked by the economic grievances, as you mentioned. How this evolving into calls for the regime change?
Um, I don't think that movement really led to the moment that we are in right now. And I would caution against, I mean, regime. We don't know if there's going to be a regime change. There are many indicators that say there is going to be a regime change, but again, what do we mean by a regime change? Do we mean something similar to what happened in the 79 revolution, where, entire establishment is changed? Or do we mean that the current regime, the current structures of the regime would largely remain intact, and certain fundamental changes are going to be made to the leadership and how the country is run, et cetera, et cetera? That we have to wait and see. Seems like there are going to be fundamental changes, but to what extent, I don't think anybody knows. The uprising in early January and the following massacre by the regime, it was a combination of issues. Like I mentioned, so it was a continuation of those cycles of protests that have been happening in Iran, in my research and in my view, since the constitutional revolution. Um, uh, but to bring it to more contemporary times, to at least um, the last 3 decades of the Islamic Republic, um, for legitimate grievances of the people of Iran, for economic prosperity, for rights of women, for the rights of minoritized ethnics, political demands as well as economic demands. This was largely economic demands, but at the same time, it's this does not take away from the legitimacy of the protesters and their demands, but at the same time seems like it was also somewhat manufactured by the United States and Israel. They knew if they push the Iranian currency to collapse, there is going to be widespread dissent. So many people are going to lose their livelihoods and their lives that are already very difficult because of the Islamic Republic, and the current situation are going to be worse. And they were hoping that they would bring down the government somehow. But as we could see, that did not happen. And so here we are in this current moment of war.
And in 2025, the US-Israel strikes the Iranians' nuclear and defense, air defense targets. So, what has been the impact on Iran's military capabilities and its regional influences? In terms of the regional influences, I think the regime mostly lost its capabilities, its proxies, especially starting from the Syria. Syria is gone, and Lebanon. So the Hezbollah's power is significantly degraded, and now remain the Houthi at the hand. So how do you see it affect to the Iran's military capabilities and
Um,
also regional influences, as I said?
so for Iran's proxies, I think to understand that we have to go back to October 7th, and the ripple effect, the domino effect that that kind of caused, the severe weakening and de-influencing of Hamas, Hezbollah, and then later on fall of Bashar Assad. And as you mentioned, so Iran has lost many of its proxies or influence that it used to have in the region, but it still has some significant influence in Iraq with Hashd al-Shabi and Katab Hezbollah and the Houthis and even Lebanese Hezbollah to some extent are still active. And
Maintain its capabilities.
yes, and so post the 12-day war, I think the IRGC and the elite in the Islamic Republic could see this day coming, and they prepared for it. They have managed to place different layers of leadership in case one player is eliminated, and also they learned from those lessons and they put them into place. One of the reasons they so swiftly and so violently killed thousands of people in January was to prevent this moment and to respond in a way swiftly to Israel and to the United States, that they are here to stay and they want to survive and they're willing to do anything and everything, including massacring many thousands of their own citizens. What I would like to point out and underline for your audiences is that this is not a dichotomy. This whole regional issue with Iran and others. It's not a dichotomy. It's not that one side is good and naturally the other side is going to be bad. So if the Islamic Republic is pummeling and repressing its own citizens, then the United States and Israel must be good. Or if Israel is committing a genocide in Palestine, then definitely, and the Islamic Republic's rhetoric is pro-Palestine, then Islamic Republic must be good. No, there are far too many. It's far too complex, and political and national and economic interests are at play here, and it's far more nuanced.
And with the recent killing of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in US and joint Israeli attacks. So how is this the provincial leadership council will attempting to stabilize the regime during this transition period and under the war, under the strike, under the missile? Do you think that they will be able to stabilize?
We will have to wait and see. I mean, this is what I was talking about. This is one of the provisions in case, because we knew that Khamenei was being targeted during the 12-day war and was one of the main targets of Israel. And so there were provisions in place for that. We will see in the next few days what they're capable of. However, Pezeshkian, the current president and a member of that council you mentioned, he's been long known as having very little powers. Ajay Mohseni Ajay, who was the head of the judiciary, to up until before we started recording this show, I don't know, things might have changed. We are not sure. There's no proof of life to ensure that he's actually alive. And then the other member, Muhammad Arafi, I think, he is not one of the hardliners. And I think the next few days, how the attacks go and who can negotiate with the United States, and who the United States is willing, which factions, both from within the regime, because there are different factions within the regime and there are different factions within the opposition, and also there's the big elephant in the room. aka the IRGC, with all their might and power, and both economically, militarily, and ideologically, who the United States is willing to negotiate with. But for now, I think it's more of a symbolic measure, this provisional leadership, just to signal to the people of Iran and in the region, internationally, that, well, you might have killed our leader, but we're still going. And you can see that kind of reflected in Ali Larijani's rhetoric today, and others, actually Pezeshkian's as well.
And looking ahead, Dr. Maral, what potential scenarios could emerge from this current?
I'm sorry, you're cutting off.
Dr. Maral, could you hear me? I think there is some
I
small
can hear you
minor
now.
technical.
I can hear you
Yes.
now.
I think if we're looking ahead in the future, what potential scenarios could emerge from the current power vacuum, including the risk of sectarian conflict or a shift toward national governance? Who are more capable to filling this power vacuum in case of the regime change, or if the regime was able to maintain its power, what will happen?
Like I mentioned, we have to wait and see, especially wait and see how much damage the IRGC is going to incur. There are various groups, and so far, as far as the ethnic groups, it seems they're very their approach has been so far very measured. They're refraining from entering into any kind of sectarian war or civil war, that we were warned and posed as horrifying Syrianization for long. So far, it seems that they're waiting and waiting to see what's happening. And in fact, a few days ago, 5 Kurdish groups came together. They put as in a coalition and put out a statement saying that they're ready to run the Kurdish regions and willing to extend the helping hand into the other um, parts of Iran and help run uh, the country. But like I said, IRGC is a very significant contender, not just not because of their military powers, but because they've enmeshed themselves in the economy, and they have a significant share of that, and that's not something they're willing to give up easily. And they're highly ideological. Artish, or the military, on the other hand, is not as ideological as it's a bit more secular than the IRGC. So that's a different story. And like I mentioned, we have to see any scenarios that we come up at this time, and there are so many different scenarios that we can come up with, are going to be meaningless probably within 24 hours, and how things are going to change. But for me, what I look for is Larijani, Ali Larijani, and how his rhetoric shapes, because he's a technocrat. He was Khamenei's first hand, and he seems to be the go-between right now. And he's a security figure, a high intelligence service figure. Former President Rouhani, the current Security Council, some of the other technocrats in the government, and at the same time, looking at what the MEK or Mujahideen Khalq are doing and saying, because they're also a very large, organized, resourceful, well outfitted group outside of Iran, though they're considered a cult by many Iranians and they're loathed, but they have considerable influence within Iran. as we could see by they attacked the Khamenei's house a few days ago, and they have apparently 10,000 sleeper cells, not 10,000 people, 10,000 sleeper cells in Iran. So as much as they may be hated, they're still a considerable group, and they have considerable ties to foreign governments. So we shall wait and see how this is going to unfold.
And there is another concern about the escalating tensions and spreading the conflict over the region. As you know, the US and Israel targeting the Iran, and in response, Iran targeting the US bases in the region, specifically in the Gulf, as we see that they targeted Dubai with over 200 missiles. And as recently I checked it, I think the 600 missile, 60 missile to Qatar and Kuwait and Jordan, and to missile Saudi Arabia. So, how do you think this will spread over a broad regional conflict, and to what extent international player could, stabilize or involving these escalations?
So it is already a regional war. It is already, and the United Kingdom is already involved in it. We have to wait and see if and when other countries might get involved. It's interesting. The IRGC or the Iranian state, I can't remember which, published a statement. Oh, actually, it was Araghchi, the foreign minister, stated it's taking a book from Israeli handbook of propaganda, actually saying we're not attacking our neighbors, referring to Dubai and UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc. We are attacking the assets of the United States and Israel in these countries. But we're friendly with all of our neighbors, and so that's one thing. Another interesting tidbit is the fact that should Iran, because USS Ford, Gerald Ford, is parked near Israel, should Iran even accidentally um, strike that, apparently that would um, uh, kind of push the NATO members to get involved, which that would, I guess, would include Turkey at the time, at this time, and other. So it would become a much bigger issue. So far, Iran has been restrained and measured, not to invite that kind of catastrophe. But like I said, by the time we finish this interview and go back to checking the news, things could have changed dramatically. So that is the nature of the beast at this moment.
Yes, I hope they will not go to the using of kind of the tactical nuclear weapons.
Absolutely.
From the US side. And in terms of the economic recovery, what structural reforms will be necessary for a post-regime Iran to address corruption, inflations, environmental crisis, for sustainable growth, and of course, the women rights and the human rights, ethnic group rights? What will be your observation?
Very quickly, in terms of economy, for as long as Iran is a rentier state, meaning it's a state that sells its natural resources, and the government sells them, and then it kind of disperses it amongst its citizens. It doesn't matter if the government is called, is run by Hitler or by Khamenei or by, the most democratic person in the world. This is going to be the nature of the beast, because the government will need very little, will rely very little on its citizens for its resources, unlike in many democratic states where, the government's income is largely from taxes, either from individuals or businesses. So this sort of, and then that system gives rise, as it is right now, to a clientelism system, and to people who whoever gets closer ideologically or economically to the state can benefit from it. So there has to be a fundamental change to that system of running that kind of rentier state, relying on natural resources and not so much on industry. And at the same time, in terms of human rights, in terms of more social justice in the country for women, to minoritized ethnics, to um, minority religious groups, political groups, etc., it has to be a democratic and plurally minded um, state that doesn't repeat the rhetoric of the current state in the Islamic Republic, that understands for democracy to thrive and for Iran to be a more stable regime, power cannot be concentrated at the hand of the central government, and it has to be more dispersed and decentralized, and kind of listen to some of these more marginalized ethnic groups across the nation, especially in the periphery, both economically and geographically, to it, it needs to be a more inclusive uh, government, and in terms of and a more independent judiciary.
And what kind of the opportunity exists for the civil society and the political groups to influence a democratic transition in case of the regime survival? And drawing from the historical uprising and current public sentiment, how we can see the situations?
Um, the Iranian civil society, I would give them that. They've been very resilient despite being under attack, regime after regime, year after year, and they keep reproducing, refining their demands, especially their democratic demands. There are um, civil society groups, and the regime has done its best to imprison them, displace them, buy them, or physically eliminate them by executions, and as we like to say in Persian, by suiciding them, um, eh, and which is the way of authoritarian states. But they've managed to still thrive in some areas, and although they're under grave repression and pressure, and um, they have a long way to come. Yet they're doing their best. I would suggest that there are many parts that they could still work on, um, in terms of women's rights and minoritized ethnics. But at the same time, there is so much we don't know about these groups, because many of them are underground. Many of them are obviously not free to speak about their plans. But all these social movements and everything that is going on, that is a testament to how powerful they are and how resilient they have been in the past decades.
And Dr. Mel, lastly, uh, envision the future. How could a transformed Iran integrate into the global community, balancing its cultural heritage with modern governance to benefit its people long term?
Um, I think, like you said, it's going to be quite a long-term investment in education, and they all go hand in hand. Education at the same time as a more democratic government, and by education I don't simply mean academics, the media, cultural productions, and all those that go on in a society, but all of that really depends at this point with depends on the conclusion and the result of the current war.
Just one of my audiences before closing our show, he asked, "Is it possible that a military coup take place?" Do you think that's a possibility within the IRG?
I mean, it is a possibility, but at this point, I don't really see what the point of a coup would be because the IRGC is the de facto leader at this point. So why stage a coup if they already are largely in charge?
Thank you very much, Dr. Maral. In this specific period of time, and you join my show, you share your experience, knowledge with my audiences.
Thank you so much. And for everyone who listened and is going to listen in the future. And I want to extend my sincerest condolences to everyone in the region that has lost a loved one or has whose lives have changed because of this conflict. Thank you for having me.
And specifically to the family of school, I think they have been bombed. I think the number reached to the 200.
There are large
Yeah,
numbers. We don't. I mean,
yeah,
there's
it's really
yeah,
a
it is
devastating news, and I hope it
it is
will
very
completely
tragic.
go. Okay. And for my audiences, please don't forget to subscribe to channel, share this beautiful conversation with your friend who are interested with geopolitics and international affairs, and please stay tuned. We have too many upcoming shows about critical developments across the world. Just hit the notification bell and stay ahead. A good night.